The dress was already hanging on the back of my door, white to the floor, long sleeves the way the church required. My mother had ironed it that afternoon while I sat on the edge of my bed with a piece of paper in my hands and a secret in my chest that I had been given 3 hours earlier and told never to repeat. The paper was folded in quarters. It had been pressed into my hand in the hallway outside the kitchen by my Aunt Vera, who had held my wrist for a moment before she let go and said, "You didn't hear this from me." Then she walked back into the kitchen and resumed talking about the luncheon desserts for the following afternoon. Strawberry cake. She thought it would be better than lemon. I still remember the weight of that paper, how light it was for what it carried. Before I tell you what I did with the next 10 hours, I want you to know that I was not a weak girl. I want you to understand that clearly, because what I am about to tell you is not a story about weakness. My name is Ruth, and I am 81 years old, and this is Ruth, the Mormon grandmother. The channel where I finally say the things the church asked me to keep silent. I spent more than half my life inside those silences. I am done with them now. These are my stories, told in the order that I can bear to tell them. To understand what that night cost me, you need to understand what a temple ceiling is, not the way the church would explain it to an investigator, and not the way it appears in a press release. The way it actually feels when you are 19 years old and standing at the edge of it. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, marriage is not merely a legal or even a spiritual ceremony. It is a binding performed inside the temple, in a room called the Celestial Room, before an officiator called a sealer. What is sealed on earth is considered sealed in heaven, permanently, across time, across death, across whatever life comes after this one. The phrase they use is for time and all eternity, not until death do you part. Eternity, the word is not decorative. They mean it in the most literal theological sense they can construct. To enter the temple, you must hold a current temple recommend, a small card issued by your bishop after a private interview in which you are asked, among other things, whether you sustain the president of the church as prophet, seer, and revelator, whether you keep the word of wisdom, whether you are morally clean, whether you associate with groups that oppose the church. The recommend is a gate. Without it, you cannot be present at your own child's wedding if they are sealed inside. Parents have stood in parking lots. Grandparents have driven 4 hours and sat on benches outside stone walls because their recommend had lapsed, or because they had left, or because they had sinned in some way the bishop had decided was disqualifying. I had a recommend. I was morally clean. I was obedient. I had never given anyone reason to question any of it. The man I was to be sealed to the following afternoon, I will call him Garrett, because that is close enough to his name that it still catches in my throat, had been chosen with great care and considerable involvement from both our families and our bishop. He was 24. He had returned from his mission the previous spring. He worked for his father's lumber business in a town 40 miles north. He had a broad face, large hands, and a way of waiting for the bishop to finish a sentence before he spoke that I had been told was a sign of good character. I had seen him 14 times before our engagement was announced. We had never been alone together for more than 15 minutes. This was not considered unusual. This was considered appropriate. The paper my Aunt Vera pressed into my hand said 3 things. I have memorized them the way you memorize a scar, not because you want to, but because it is there every time you look. The first, Garrett had a child, a boy, born 14 months prior. The second, the mother was a young woman named Candace, who had been a member of his home congregation. She was transferred to a ward in another city 6 weeks after the child was born. The child was being raised by Candace's mother, and neither Garrett's name nor any acknowledgement of paternity appeared anywhere in any record that anyone intended to find. The third, my mother knew. She had known for 6 weeks. She had decided it did not change anything. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after I read that. The white dress hung on the door. From downstairs, I could hear my sisters helping with the dinner dishes. I could hear my father's voice, low and satisfied. Through the window, I could see the neighbour's yard lamp beginning to glow against the early dark of February. A Tuesday in February of 1962, and I was 19 years old, and in approximately 17 hours I was going to be sealed for time and all eternity to a man who had a child I was not supposed to know existed. I want to stop here and ask you something. If you have found this channel and you are still watching, I think it is because something in your own life has brought you here. Maybe you understand what it is to hold a piece of information that no one around you will allow you to name. If that is you, I want you here when I finish telling this story. Please subscribe to Ruth the Mormon Grandmother and turn on the notification bell. These stories take me a long time to find the words for, and I need you to be there when I do. What I did not do that night is as important as what I did. I did not go downstairs and tell my mother what Vera had shown me. I turned that option over in my mind for several minutes and understood something with an awful clarity. The moment I walked downstairs with that information, it would become a problem I had caused. Vera would be confronted. The story would shift until the crisis was not Garrett's hidden child, but my willingness to repeat something I had been given in confidence. I would be told that Candace had made her choices, that the child was provided for, that dwelling on it was uncharitable, that the Lord required us to look forward. I knew this with the same certainty you know, when you are 19 and have lived inside a system your entire life, exactly how the system will respond. I did not pray. I know that sounds like the detail that will disturb some of you more than any other. But I understood, in that particular silence, that the answer I would receive from prayer that night would be the answer the system needed me to receive. I had seen it too many times. Prayer, in moments of institutional inconvenience, had a way of arriving in the form of peace about the very thing you were uncertain of. I was not willing to ask that question and receive that answer, and then have to decide what the answer meant. I did not call anyone. There was no one to call who existed outside the same walls. What I did was this. I opened the drawer of the desk beside my bed, the small oak desk where I had done my homework all through school, where I had written letters to cousins and thank you notes for Christmas. And I took out a piece of lined paper and a blue pen. And I began to write a letter to Garrett. Not the letter you are imagining. I did not write an accusation. I did not write a confrontation. I did not write the letter of a girl threatening to expose anything. I wrote the letter of a girl trying to understand who she actually was, using the only audience available to her, a man who would never read it. I wrote for a long time. I wrote about what I had been told and what it meant to me. I wrote about Candace, this woman I had never met, whose name I had been given on a folded piece of paper like a secret the size of a life. I wrote about her child. I wrote about what it must have been like to be her, to be the girl the ward transferred rather than the man they excused. I wrote 2 full pages about her before I ever wrote a sentence about myself. Then I wrote about what I wanted. Not what I wanted to do, what I wanted to be. It took me a long time to understand the difference between those 2 things. But that night, with the dress hanging on the door, I somehow already knew enough to separate them. I wanted to be a woman who had looked at the truth and named it to herself, even if she named it only on paper, even if no one ever read it, even if she folded it into quarters the next morning and sealed it in an envelope and placed it in the bottom of a hat box behind her winter coats and went downstairs and put on the white dress and walked into the temple and let a man in a white suit bind her for time and all eternity to a man she did not trust. Which is exactly what I did. And here is the thing about surviving a system you cannot yet leave. Sometimes the most radical act available to you is documentation, naming what happened, writing it down and keeping it. Not as a weapon, not as a plan, just as evidence, held privately, that you were there, that you knew, that you were not fooled, even when you could not afford not to be. I want to stop again here, because I think some of you watching right now may have felt that exact thing, may have lived in that exact space between knowing and being able to act on what you know. If you grew up in a community where your silence was a form of belonging and your doubt was a form of betrayal, I want this channel to reach you. Please subscribe to Ruth the Mormon Grandmother. I am trying to find the women who grew up the way I did. I want us to be able to find each other. I kept the letter for 55 years. It moved with me through 3 houses and 2 states and 1 divorce and the deaths of both my parents. It survived a flood in our basement in 1988 that took boxes of photographs I will never recover. It lived at the bottom of a succession of hat boxes and then, eventually, a cedar chest in my bedroom. I never reread it. Not once in 55 years. I did not need to. I knew what it said. I had written it with enough care that I knew it would stay exactly as I had left it. 2 years after my husband died, I finally opened the cedar chest. I read the letter in a single sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold. I was 76. I read the handwriting of my 19-year-old self, the girl with the white dress on the door and the piece of paper in her hands. And I understood something that I could not have named then, but can name clearly now. What I had done that night was not resignation. It was not defeat. It was the first act of what a therapist I began seeing in my late 60s would later call coercive control resistance. The way people who cannot leave a controlling environment sometimes preserve their own interior life precisely because they understand that the exterior must comply. You keep a record. You bear witness to yourself. You do not let the institution also take your memory of what you saw. There is a term for what I had lived inside: spiritual coercion. The ceiling was not merely a wedding. It was a contract signed under conditions of radical information asymmetry, inside an institution that held every social consequence available to a young woman's life: my family, my community, my belonging, my eternal fate, as I had been taught to understand it. These were not background conditions. They were the frame inside which every choice I had was offered to me. I went through with the marriage. I will not tell that story today. It is its own story, or several stories, for other episodes. What I will tell you is that the letter was not a failure. The letter was the beginning of the only sovereignty I had access to at 19 years old, and I held it for 55 years. And when I finally read it again, it told me something true. I had always known. There was never a version of my life in which I did not know. If you grew up in a world where the people who were supposed to protect you decided that their comfort and your compliance were the same thing, I know what that cost you. If you were handed someone else's secret and told it was not your business, and then made to build your life on top of it as though it were solid ground, I see that. If you ever sat alone in a room with a truth you were not allowed to speak and found the only way to survive it was to write it down for no one, you were not being passive, you were being precise. The letter is gone now. I burned it last spring in my backyard on a Sunday afternoon in April, in a small clay pot I bought at the garden centre. Not because I wanted to destroy it, because I had finally told someone what it said. Because this channel exists. Because you are here. Until next time, The life that was sealed for you is not the only life you are allowed to want.